Welcome to Roberts and Janice Live, this time for July the 2nd in the year of our Lord 2025. So glad you could be with us today. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And in my role as host of this program, I will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, scripture, tradition, the fathers, the medievals, the saints, the doctors, the catechisms, the encyclopedias, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every Wednesday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And barring any problems or whatever, which we are certainly keeping track of and trying to avoid, and so far, so good. So, when you call in, when you write in your question, we have two rules. One is to put the word question in capital letters before your question, so I know it's a question. And the second is to be kind and considerate to all your fellow questioners so that everyone is happy and healthy and holy. And that way we can have a good program. Usually at the top of the program, I have some email questions, not many today. Just a couple of them, and we'll address those. So we have a whole 2 hours for your questions. So do not be shy. Type out your question, put it on our chat board, and sooner or later I will get to it. Email questions. One I had sent in early this morning. And that one is from Greg, and he wants to know, Robert, could you discuss what the Catholic Church is teaching on Ishmael, who is the other son of Abraham? The book of Genesis says that God said he will make a great nation of Ishmael as well. Well, there's not much on Ishmael that we, have in the Catholic Church, except what the Bible tells us. That's all we really know about him. And that is rather short itself. Ishmael was the product of Abraham and Hagar. And you remember that was precipitated by a lack of faith of Abraham and Sarah. Although we must say that God tested them to the limits. It's not easy for a man to hear a promise of a son when he's 75, already old, and then having to wait 25 years for that son to come, and then chastised for having a lapse of faith in the 99th year. Abraham not knowing when the son's supposed to come. Like if God had said, yes, I promise you a son at age 75, and you're going to have to wait 25 years, however, for that son. Now, that would have been something to hang on to, wherein, okay, eventually I'm going to get a son. I just have to wait a long time. Can I do it? Yeah. What else am I going to do? I have no other prospects. At least that's what they thought at the time. And then Hagar comes in to the picture. But God is a very demanding God. See, I'm not going to leave the story about Ishmael without finding out about the God we serve. He means business. He is very serious about putting men on earth, having them live out their lives, and doing the best they possibly can. He's very serious about that. And he's going to allow no excuses for no one, you included. So when he promised him a son at age 75, he didn't say, you have to wait 25 years for this son. Didn't even say that to him. Just said, I promise you a son. As far as Abraham knew, it might come next year. I'm sure him and Sarah were, in the marital embrace for quite a while. Wanted children and knew this was the way that it happened. So let's get to it. And we're doing that for quite a while. And no children, you see. But at least he waited in the proper years, that is, the year she would most likely get pregnant. And I want to say something here also about this. I didn't mean to go on this whole little story just about Ishmael. Ishmael is the product of all this. And if we're going to do a worthy job of him and his time, we need to cover this whole story. So that's why I'm going into some depth here. And what was I going? Now I missed what I was going to say. Trying to explain to you why I'm doing this. Now I forgot what I was going to say. It had to do with the faith. It just slipped right out. Anyway, while I'm thinking of it, let me say who Ishmael was the progenitor of. All the Arab nations. That's where they all come from, Ishmael. Okay? Isaac, the other son that came after Ishmael, was a progenitor of the Jewish nation. Okay? So, if you want to point any finger as to the direction of where it all started, the Arabs against the Israelis, it's right here with Ishmael and Isaac. Okay? So, to answer Greg's question, when God told Ishmael that he will make a great nation of him, he did. Long time ago. And they're still here. They're called the Arabs. And there's probably a dozen of them, a dozen nations. And I think that's what God had promised Ishmael, a dozen. So there you have it. But that's as far as the scripture goes. Okay, that's as far as history goes. But I forget what else I was going to say about Abraham and his faith. I know what I was going to say. After the flood, if you look at the genealogies of Genesis 10 and 11, they have the genealogies after the flood. Shem was 600 years old, and then after him, it gives a line of about 10 of the post-flood fathers, and their ages go down to Abraham, who was 175 when he died, and his father Terah, who was over 200. And then you had some people before him, of course, and they were in the 400s. But if you look at the ages of these men when they started having children, okay, And there's a little mix-up in the interpretations of Terah and Abraham, because it looks like Terah was 165 or so. What was it? When Abraham was born. And that's a wrong reading, a wrong interpretation of those passages. And I cover this in my refutation of, it's a CD I made, or DVD I made, that covers 10 issues with the Bible where people think the Bible contradicts itself. And this is one of them. Because they miscalculate how to interpret when Abraham was born. And why is this important? Because Abraham's birth, of course, is connected to when he became a father. Okay. And you might ask, if Abraham thought, not if, he did think it, he thought that Sarah was too old at age 90 to have a child. Now, if under our previous understanding, these ancient men, pre-flood and post-flood, were having children much later in life than we normally do. Okay? So, Noah himself was 950 years old when he died, 600 years when the flood came. So that's a pretty long time for him and his wife, yet they only had 3 children. Whoa, what's the deal here? Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's it. So if he's living so long, 600 years before the flood, when things were more pristine than they are after the flood, of course, why is he only having 3 children? And if you look at the average of the children that we know about, there's really not a whole lot of them. Adam and Eve have, it says they had other sons and daughters. Okay. We know that much. And that's pre-flood, so we would expect some fruitfulness in reproductivity. But here's the thing. If you look at the genealogies of Genesis 10 and 11, and you find out when these patriarchs had their sons, from Shem onward down to Lamech, Abraham, and even Joseph. Joseph died, he was 110. It says, so-and-so begat so-and-so when he was 32 years old, or 34 years old, or, 35 maybe. And the average age of when these patriarchs had their first child was 32. Same age as it is today. Isn't that something? You would think that it would be longer. And that's what people think about Terah and Abraham, but they got that wrong. As a matter of fact, what we can say is Abraham and Terah are not an exception to the rule. They follow the rule, and that rule is the average age is 32. Which means what? If the men are having their first child at 32, how old are the women? Their wives. Not much older, of course. Probably younger. And so, guess what? Their reproductive activity is taking place at the same time as ours does. Oh, yeah. And isn't that interesting? So the biology's already in the mix. It's not that because these patriarchs live older that their wives are going to have reproductive years in the hundreds. No, it is not that way. It's not that way. They have their kids early, and then the kids grow up with them and they live into longevity with those children, but they don't have any more children. That's only for a certain period of time. Okay? In the 20s, 30s, 40s, and that's it. It closes. So this is why Abraham and Sarah are like, you want us to have a child? Come on, man. We're already past that stage of normal reproductivity. And now she's 90. No wonder he thought she couldn't bear children any longer. He's looking at 90 years old just like we do. What woman do you know who's 90 is going to have a child? So you can honestly say to God, you sure about this? So we can see why when Hagar says, look, I can't have any kids. This is laughable. And that's what she did. She laughed in God's face. Yeah, both Abraham and Sarah laughed at God. And God says, well, I'm going to have the last laugh because you're going to name your son Laughed. That's what Isaac means in Hebrew. Laughed. So you'll remember it for a pretty long time that you laughed at God's promise. So, but even when God made the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 that he would have a child, Sarah was 65. Abraham was 75. You don't have children at age 65, even then, as we now know, because the average age is like 20 to 30 to 40, not 65. So even then, it's like out of the ordinary that God's coming to Abraham and telling him. So you can see the predicament that Abraham's in. This is not easy. You know, he's trying to be a sensible, logical man. You know, hey, I wake up every morning, I do my chores, I do this, I do that. Okay, I see how life works. Let me continue to do it. I put one foot in front of the other every day, and I go by what I know from yesterday, and everything works out. And I can live that way. Okay. And then God comes and tells him he's going to have a child. And he's 75 and his wife is 65. And they know this just doesn't happen. All right. So he's in a predicament. Okay. Who is this God who's telling him this? Is this some kind of, monster coming and upsetting his world and telling him things that aren't true to get him to fall? Or is this really the God of the universe who's telling me to do something quite out of the ordinary because he's got an extraordinary task for me to do, and that's to bring the Savior into the world? This is like, whoa. This is God doesn't come knocking on his door. Hey, I got a proposition for you. I need to bring the Savior in the world. I need to use men to do it. Can you help me out? No. He upsets Abraham's whole life. Move out of the place you're at. 75 years old. Go over here. And, I'm going to give you a son, even though you're 100 years old and your wife's 90. And you got to believe me. And by the way, God, after Abraham gets his son, just one more thing I need from you. Yeah, I'm going to test you to make sure you're the man I want to do this extraordinary job. And so I want you to take your son up to the mountain and stick a knife in his chest. Can you do that for me? Yeah, I know it's kind of an odd request, but you know me, right? I'm not going to lead you astray. I'm not going to deceive you. I mean, I got better things to do. So, and the man falters. Before the whole Isaac thing with the sacrifice on the mountain, he does falter. Him and his wife laugh at God's promise, and Sarah says, "What are we messing with this for? Just take Hagar. Look, I'm 90 years old. Take Hagar as your, I don't know, what do you want to call her, and raise a child with her." And he does. So, maybe God pushed him too far. He told him, "You're going to have a son." He doesn't have one for 25 years. Do you think a man might reach the limit of his patience by then? It might be easy to air our armchair quarterback and say, "Oh, Abraham, come on, man." Because you know the end of the story. It's easy for you, but put yourself back in his place. Do you think God might have pushed him too far? I mean, because at first he's like gung-ho. I really believe everything God told me. And, he falters along the way by telling Abimelech that Sarah is his sister when she's his wife, because he's not fully trusting in God, that God's going to protect Sarah from Abimelech. So already we see him cracking under the pressure. And the question is, did God put him under too much pressure, that we now have him taking Hagar as his wife and producing Ishmael? And then God promises Ishmael to make a great nations of him. And look what we have today. They're at each other's throats, as they have been for centuries. And you might say it's all because Abraham and Sarah cracked under the pressure and brought Hagar into the picture to have Ishmael. Wow. So there's the story behind Ishmael. All right. Now, somebody asked me to look at a booklet that Jimmy Akin of Catholic Answers wrote on justification. I think the book's title is Justification by Faith and Works, ? And so I did. I went through the book, and I've got some things to say. Let me just say first, I know Jimmy is trying to make justification simple for the Catholic and the Protestant. And I can tell in the way he treats it, that he doesn't like to be at odds with people about such things, that he wishes we could all agree and shake hands and pat each other on the back and say, "Brother, I'm going to see you in heaven." Catholic to Protestant, Protestant to Catholic. And so his heart's in the right place. Okay? I don't want to say that much. And it's funny, when I read this book, I got to the end of it. I had a lot of things I had to bring up, that I'm going to bring up rather, that are problematic with the book. But at the end, he's saying pretty much the opposite of what he did in the beginning of the book. Because in the beginning, he's trying to make room for this phrase, faith alone, that Catholics and Protestants don't get all bent out of shape on this phrase, faith alone. Because if you know anything about the justification, salvation issue, that has been I don't know what analogy to use, but that phrase, faith alone, like just the sound of it triggers your So, but Jimmy's trying to make room for this phrase between Catholics and Protestants. And then he gets to the end of the booklet, and the booklet gives like 5 or 6 reasons why we shouldn't use the phrase faith alone. So, which was quite surprising. And I had to agree with every one of them why we shouldn't, because I've used them myself. When I was arguing against Jimmy Akin's view of justification, I would say, and at the end of the day, we shouldn't use it because blah, 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 blah. Almost the same reasons that Jimmy Akin has given in his booklet that's trying to make room for faith alone. So, and that's why I say that I think his motivation, his heart's in the right place. Because he gets to the end of the story the same as somebody like me would, who's very careful about what we say about justification. And we don't give an inch to the Protestants, as you can tell if you've ever read my book, Not by Faith Alone, which has been around now for almost 30 years, 775 pages of everything you ever wanted to know about justification. And then some. I don't let them get away with anything, the Protestants. Okay? And then I come to the reasons why nobody should be using the phrase faith alone. Okay? Jimmy is... he has more of a relaxed attitude toward the Protestants, saying, well, it's not that bad, kind of when they use that phrase, as long as they mean this, Well, that's the question. Do they mean that? I think Jimmy makes a lot of assumptions that they may not be as harmful because they may not be using it in that harmful way that everybody's pointing the finger at. Well, is that the case? Okay, so that's what I'll do here in some of this, and it's rather long, and I'll try to cut it down. But when I do these things, I just sort of dive into it and don't come up for air until I'm done, and it's just the way it goes. So let me just take a stab at it here. Oh, I just saw a question here. It says, how do you explain Adam's age of 130 years when he begot Seth? How do I explain it? He's pre-Diluvian, okay? Antediluvian. When I said the average age was 32, I'm talking about the post-Diluvian, the genealogies in Genesis 10 and 11, not the ones in Genesis 5. Okay, Jay? All right. That just sort of stuck out at me, so I couldn't let it go. All right, so let me read what Jimmy says in his booklet. He says, unfortunately, there is considerable disagreement about what precisely justification involves. Suffice it to say that the way typical American evangelicals use the term, when God justifies someone, he declares the person's sins forgiven and proclaims the person righteous. This is an event that occurs at the beginning of the Christian life when a person first turns to God. As far as it goes, this description is correct. Catholic theology would say that there is Catholic theology would say that there is more to justification than that, but it is true that at the beginning of the Christian life, God forgives a person's sins and declares him righteous. And that is wrong. That's a wrong way to characterize it. It's a wrong way to describe what Catholics will accept. Let me point it out to you. Jimmy says, but it is true that at the beginning of the Christian life, God forgives a person's sins and declares him righteous. No. Because when you use the phrase declares him righteous, that is a Protestant, exclusively Protestant way of understanding justification. That is a legal term wherein you declare something, and that declaration itself becomes a reality. Okay? Just the declaring of it becomes a reality. And that's why Protestants use that particular word, declaration, because they believe that justification is a legal state that you come into, not a real state that something has changed in you. It's a legal label put on you that says you are now considered righteous. So it's a declaration, legal declaration that you could put on your forehead that says righteous. Doesn't matter what's inside here. It just says declared righteous because God said so. Okay? That is not, let me emphasize, not the Catholic way of either understanding justification, how it's procured, why it's procured, nothing even close to that. Okay? You've got to understand this. And you can't let the word declare slip by as if it's, well, we'll just let that go. No, it's the word that they use, the legal word for forensic justification. Forensic means legal. And that's all they believe justification is, a legal declaration made by God that makes it real because God said it. I mean, you get into the whole nominalistic argument here from the nominalists of the 12th, 13th century. It's like, what's real? Something that is real in itself, or that we label as what it may be. And that label makes it real. That's why it's called nominalism, because nominalism is name. You see, if I put a name on it, does that make it what it is? Or is it something else, internal, you see, that may or may not have a label, but it is what it is. So this whole thing about declaring is vitally important to understand. So let's go on with what else he says. There's a lot that can be said about what works are in the Bible, but for reasons of space, we won't be going into that here. Fake. Because if there's one thing you need to know, is that for all the complicated ways it talks about justification, there is a fact we need to know. And that's that it talks about works in two entirely different ways. On the one hand, the Bible condemns works like the biggest anathema that there is. The Bible encourages works. You got to do works. You got to do this. You got to do works of love and works everywhere. So we have two different, like night and day, how the Bible deals with works. And so for Jimmy to say, well, we won't be going into defining works in the Bible, that's why I think that's a mistake. Okay? If there's one distinction you need to know, it's the distinction the Bible makes about works. And if you don't, you're going to get confused. I guarantee it. All right, let's move on. He says, remember, Protestants use the term justification to refer to an event at the beginning of the Christian life where God forgives us and declares us righteous. Consequently, a Protestant will think that the Catholic is saying that we need to do works in order to come to God and be forgiven. Maybe not. Trent, the Council of Trent, this is still Jimmy Akin speaking, thus denies the very thing that our Protestant brethren fear it asserts, and that we lead them to believe if we simply tell them without further qualification that we believe in justification by faith and works. All right, in other words, Jimmy is saying, if we just use this phrase, if Catholics say to the Protestant, we're justified by faith and works, okay? Well, the Protestant's going to think that somehow we've missed something in the Scripture, because the Bible condemns works for justification. So you see how the two definitions of works are immediately going to smack us across the face. Because the Catholic is using works in the positive sense when he uses the phrase justified by faith and works. Protestant's using works in the negative sense when he says, no, we're not justified by works. Why you need to know what kind of talking about. Good works or bad works? And then there's even an area the Catholic would say, yeah, no works. Good works, bad works, in between works, mediocre works, doesn't make any difference. You're not saved by works. Well, the Catholic can agree to that too. First canon of the Council of Trent says, nothing you do or works. If you want to get down to brass tacks, we all talk so much about works. Well, hey, put your faith in there too. That doesn't even justify you. It's only the grace of God that have either one of those works. Okay? So, I mean, if you want to get down to the bare bones of it, we can use that language too. But then you come up to the upper level. We've already agreed that it's all Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Orthodox, Muslim, whoever is up going to be saved, it's all by God's grace. It's where it all starts. Okay? And if you start any other place, well, you're not going to be saved, whoever you are. We can all agree to that. All right, so here, but I'll skip them. You get to a more important part. All right, Jimmy says, if you go through Trent's Justification, section on justification in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is sections 1987 to 1995, you won't find the phrase faith and works. And you won't find the word works in the Catechism section at all. So if Jim is this up as a point, then we have to ask, what's he implying? He's saying, the phrase faith and works is not used in Trent or in the Catechism. Does that mean something? Well, Jimmy thinks it does. And he's implying that because the phrase faith and works is not used, that justification is not faith and works. Okay? The Catholics have said that justification is by faith and works. Why? Well, faith is good and works can be good. They all know that. So why can't we say faith and works? Justification is by faith and works. Obviously, if I have to do work and I have to have faith, it's faith and works. So what's wrong with that? Well, it's like just says too much for the sensitive Protestant. Maybe so. That doesn't make it wrong, though. And that's not the reason Trent would avoid the phrase faith and works, 3 words put together in sequence. Because Trent, as the Catechism, will put faith in one sentence and works in another sentence, or the next 2 sentences. They don't have to be, in other words, this is not an issue where if the phrase faith and works is used, then automatically it's disqualified because they're too close together, works and faith. No, that really has nothing to do with it. Okay, so all right, Jimmy says, without further explanation, this reinforces the problem we mentioned above. It will lead a Protestant to think the Catholics hold that we must do works in order to come to God and be forgiven. Confronted with this claim, a Protestant may respond, but that's not the kind of justification that James is talking about. Before dismissing this statement, a Catholic should be aware of one thing. The Church doesn't disagree. The Magisterium doesn't quote James 2:24 in connection with the justification that occurs at the beginning of the Christian life. It interprets this verse as referring to a different justification. Now, I'm sorry, Jimmy, but you just declared a heresy there. And I mean that with every fiber of my being. I don't care if you're Jimmy Akin or Jimmy the Pope or whoever you are, that is an absolutely false statement. So, and the reason why is maybe you didn't read it clearly enough, but the Council of Trent uses James 2:24 both for the subsequent progression of justification and for initial justification. And it's as clear as day in chapter 7 of the session 6 of the Council of Trent, where it says that we are infused with faith, hope, and love at baptism for the event of justification. Okay, so You made a mistake there, buddy, and you need to go clean that one up. You need to take this book off the market, rewrite it, and fix it. Okay? Because the church does disagree with the Protestants. You said the church doesn't disagree. The magisterium doesn't quote James 2:24 in connection with the justification that occurs at the beginning of the Christian life. It does. Okay? I should have had this clear here. Okay, so and that's the difference between Catholic and Protestant justification. Why can the church say that works or love, charity, if you want to call it that, is part of the initial justification of an individual? Because the church believes that those virtues are infused as substantive things into the soul, another substantive thing of the individual. It's like you're pouring water into a jar. The jar, analogously, is the soul. The water is the faith, hope, and love. Make it 3 different colors if you want. Red, white, and blue. That's poured into the jar, the soul. And it changes the quality of the soul. It's no longer the same soul. It's been brought from death to life by the infusion of these virtues. Okay? That happens at baptism. That's what chapter 7 and chapter 8 of the canon of section 6 of Trent says. Okay? So it's initially and throughout your life that those graces are infused, and therefore you're continually justified. And you can say sanctified at the same time in the Catholic theology. Okay? So big mistake there, man. You need to clean that up and start over again. See, and I think if you do, you're going to see that how different the Catholic and Protestant concepts are. And you won't be saying that the Catholics declare justification as if, we have no problem with them making it a legal issue. We do have big problems making it a legal issue. That's why the church called it a legal fiction. It's not a legal issue. It's a substantive issue because you are literally changed inside in your soul because those virtues are poured into you. However you want to make an analogy of them as a substance that goes into a container, so to speak. That's what happens. That's not legal. After it's done, you can say, oh, let's give it a name. We'll say justified before God. Because what are we doing this for in the first place? That's the natural term, justified, you see. But even then, we consider that a substantive name that means something that has literally changed. Okay? So, I'm trying to figure out what else I should go through here because I want to make this short. See, now Akin says this. He says in his book, in the first place, God doesn't simply declare us righteous. He also makes us righteous in justification. So there he understands the Catholic side I just described to you, where he makes us righteous. Something happens inside that changes, that makes us righteous. And so he says it's not simply declare. Yeah, but that's what that's the whole thing with the Protestants is that's all they have. You see, a legal declaration. We don't need that. If you're made righteous inside, you don't need a legal declaration. Okay? That's not the way the church puts it. That somehow we have to have a legal basis because we have a substantive basis. No. Okay? We don't have things happening because God declares it. God changes us. That's what happens. Okay? And then we say we're justified. That's the declaration. If you want to have, some kind of nominal basis for to call it something, so you don't confuse it with something else. That's understandable. Okay, but you're confusing the terms. You declare is legal, to make is substantive, and the Protestants have nothing to do with that substantive change. And you want to come on their side and say, yeah, but it's like a declaring, but it's not just a declaring. You just don't do that. Okay, it's just you don't confuse the language, and it started when you said that initial justification in Catholicism has nothing to do with James 2:24, has nothing to do with works, and nothing to do with love. That's where you made your mistake. Because if you understand that initial justification includes charity, includes love, because it's infused, then you're not going to make that mistake of saying that initial justification is just a declaring of righteousness. You say. All right, let's move on. All right, so Jimmy goes on and talks about faith alone. 1, 2, 3. I should have numbered these. Now he starts talking about okay, yeah. All right, so Akin, this won't take too much longer. Akin says, note well, the canon does not say, quote, if anyone says that the sinner is justified by faith alone, let him be anathema. Now he's talking about Canon 9 of the Council of Trent, Session 6, and Canon 9. I should have copied this down somewhere. Where is it? Where is Canon 9? All right, maybe I can get it from here. So let me read this again. Akin says, note well, the canon doesn't say, if anyone says that the sinner is justified by faith alone, let him be anathema. Okay, grant you, the canon doesn't say exactly those words, yeah. Akin goes on and says, instead, it rejects a particular use of the formula. He's talking about the faith alone formula, whereby someone understands that nothing else is required to cooperate in order to obtain the grace of justification, and that it is not in any way necessary that he be prepared and disposed by the action of his own will, unquote. Trent is therefore concerned to reject faith alone when it's used to say that you don't need to do in any way cooperate with God's grace. That is, that a merely intellectual faith will save you. And that's correct. Merely agreeing with the truths of theology is not enough to save. So what Jimmy is doing, it's another mistake, because he's trying to confine faith alone to mean a certain thing. And that's it. It's over. The understanding of faith alone is now over, because we know what Trent really meant. And that is that someone believes in it because he doesn't cooperate with God's grace, and you can't do that. So that kind of faith alone is condemned. Now, I'll grant you that that kind of faith alone is condemned, but you don't stop there. Okay? We already know that Trent, because Trent said it many times, that it's against Martin Luther, John Calvin, Huldrych Zwingli, all those guys. Why? Because they are absolute predestinarians that don't believe man has a free will, and don't believe that man can cooperate in any way with justification. Okay? And they use this monogram, faith alone, as the label of what you can use to describe this position, that man doesn't cooperate with God because he has no free will. Okay, that's why Luther was condemned by the church for his views of absolute predestination, that said man cannot cooperate with God, whether before justification or after. And the Catholic Church says, yeah, he can cooperate. He can cooperate before he's justified. God can even accept his works and his faith before he even knows God. And then, of course, he can accept it afterward, too, because he's given him a free will to exercise faith and works. But Luther and Calvin said, no way can they cooperate. And that's what we're going to call faith alone, at least one part of it. So Jimmy picks this out and says, well, here's what faith alone refers to, that that men can't cooperate with God. Come on, Jimmy. You know that's not. I mean, if you've ever read Trent, he uses the phrase faith alone 13 times, and each in a different way, to describe a different aspect of faith alone that they're condemning. Okay? One is cooperation, yeah. What's another one? Let's see what else they had. Canon 14. If anyone saith that man is truly absolved from his sins and justified, because that he assuredly believed himself absolved and justified, or that no one is truly justified but he who believes himself justified, and that by this faith alone absolution and justification are effected, let him be anathema. So this is a different wrinkle on what faith alone is that the Council of Trent is condemning. This is the faith alone that most Protestants are guilty of, not the other one where cooperation is not allowed. You want to get that with the absolute predestinarians like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. But with the other Protestants, you don't get that. Like the Wesleys, the Baptists, the Unitarians, the Congregationalists, the Southern Baptists, they're all free willers. They all believe we cooperate with God. So they're not using faith alone in that sense. They're using it in another sense. And they usually use it in this sense, where they think that if faith alone itself is enough to absolve them from sin and justify them. Just because he says he believes it, they think they're justified. They're sin-free. And Canon 14 says, no, you can't do that. You can't say that because I have faith alone, that means I'm totally absolved. I have nothing to worry about. Okay? What other definitions of faith alone are there? There's Canon 29 that says, if anyone says that he who has fallen after baptism is not able by the grace of God to rise again, or that he is able indeed to recover the justice which he lost, but by faith alone, without the sacrament of penance, contrary to what the Holy Roman and Universal Church, instructed by Christ and the apostles, has taught, let him be anathema. So you got these Protestants walking around thinking they can fall from the Christian faith, and it's just a matter of revitalizing their faith, and faith alone, that's going to restore them to the church, and they go on as if nothing happened. The church says, no way. Especially if you're in mortal sin. You need the church's graces. You need to confess that to the church. That's why confession is so important, because it all is revolved around mortal sin. Because the only way that mortal sin can be forgiven is through the church's graces. Of course, Christ gives the graces to the church, but the medium is the church. Okay? So obviously, if you reject the Catholic Church, you're not going to have the means of penance, confession, to have your mortal sins forgiven. So you got all these people walking around thinking, well, just because I have faith alone, I'm justified, even though I just committed adultery 10 times in 10 years. I'm restored because I believe I'm restored. And then you have faith alone used in other places. In session 7 under the sacraments. Faith alone thinks that only faith in God is necessary and that all the sacraments are superfluous. All 7 sacraments. So you can see how far this extends. This faith alone is like a disease because it covers all these areas. So it's not just cooperation that it's denying, Jimmy. It's all the other areas. If anyone say these sacraments were instituted for the sake of nourishing faith alone, let them be anathema. In other words, the only reason we have sacraments is not to forgive sins. It's to increase my faith alone, because only faith alone saves me. So I don't need the graces of the sacraments per se. All I need is a strengthening of my faith, because that's all God's going to use to judge me, whether my faith was strong enough. And that comes in Canon 5 of Session 7, where it says, if anyone say that these sacraments are instituted for the sake of nourishing faith alone, in other words, all I need to do is make my faith stronger. So give me those sacraments to make my faith stronger, because that's what God's going to use to judge whether I'm justified or not. Faith alone. If anyone saith that by the said sacraments of the new law grace is not conferred through the act performed, but that faith alone in the divine promise suffices for the obtaining of grace, let him be anathema. In other words, what's that saying? Well, we've heard this phrase in Catholic theology, ex operate operato, which means the sacrament in itself is giving the grace that the sacrament speaks of. Okay, it works in itself. And the Protestant will come along and say, well, no, the sacrament itself has no power. Okay, What has the power is my faith in the sacrament, or my faith in Christ, or my faith, whatever I wanted it to be in. That's what's important. As long as my faith is firm, it doesn't really matter what the sacrament does or doesn't do. You see? So, you see the implications of faith alone. It covers all the areas of theology. It's not just limited to whether I cooperate with God or not. It touches every single area. Let's look at a couple of others. Canon 8. Well, that's going to go on to baptism. If anyone saith that the baptized are by baptism itself made debtors, but to faith alone, and not to the observance of the whole of Christ, let him be anathema. This is another one. Look at this. This is the faith alone that says the only faith alone is required after baptism. I'm sorry. I didn't read that right. This faith alone says that it says only faith alone is required after baptism, not the doing of the whole law of Christ. You see what they did here? I'm baptized with faith, right? And all I need to do after this baptism is keep my faith alive, increase my faith, make it firmer, make it stronger. But I am not required to do the whole law of Christ, which is what? The commandments. Okay? I'm not required to do those. Just faith, because faith is the only thing that's going to save me. Okay? So, just one more. Canon 11 says, if anyone says that faith alone is sufficient preparation for receiving the sacrament of the most holy Eucharist, let him be anathema. Even those that still believed in the Eucharist, the only thing I need to do to prepare, I don't need to fast. I don't need to go to confession for my sins. All I have to do is have faith alone. And the stronger I make my faith before I go to the Eucharist, the better off I'm going to be to be prepared for the Eucharist. I mean, it just gets silly after a while, because as you can see, it covers every area of life and of theology. And just a couple more things here. Akin says, to back up his thing on faith alone, it might come as a surprise to some Catholics, but quite a number of the church fathers used faith alone. And then he quotes from Joseph Fitzmyer from the Anchor Yale Bible, volume 33 on Romans, page 360. And I just think this is just... How would you put that? Trite? It is kind of trite. Yeah, some of the fathers used faith. And I write about this in my book, Not by Faith Alone. Okay? I show you all the fathers that use the phrase, faith alone and why they use it. But not one of them use it in the sense that Martin Luther or what I just read to you from the Council of Trent in condemning all the uses of faith alone. Did the fathers ever use it that way? Of course they didn't. You see? So to say that some of the fathers use faith alone, it doesn't mean anything. It's just an attempt to dilute the condemnation. Well, if some of the fathers used it, well, then it must be okay. No. Okay? And then he has a place where he mentions, by the way, let me say this. There were some, not many, and those that did not mean anything close to what Luther, Calvin, and other Protestants mean by it today. In Protestant days, faith alone was a repudiation of anything Catholic, not just a disagreement of the nature of justification. The Church Fathers used faith alone only as a term that separated faith from works of the law that did not justify, but that the Jews were teaching did justify. That's the difference. I mean, if you want to take the negative side, faith justifies, works don't. And remember, we agreed to that. We said, yeah, there is a whole area of theology that deals with works in the negative sense, that they're bad, that they're not going to do anything for you, and in fact can lead you further away from God. They're called bad works, or works that we presume are good but are really bad, because we shouldn't be doing works to earn our salvation in the first place, you see. So with that side, you want to make a distinction between faith and works, which is very valid. Okay? And some of the fathers used the word alone after faith to make that distinction, and one of them was Thomas Aquinas, because he says the works in Romans 3:28 are moral works, not ceremonial works. Now, that's another issue we need to clear up in Catholicism. We have so many people running around today saying that the works that are condemned are just ceremonial works, but the moral works, we still have to do them. No, the moral works were condemned also. That's what the first canon of the Council of Trent says, that any work you do, good, bad, or indifferent, is not going to count toward justification. That's the negative side of works. That's why you have to keep those two definitions in your mind when you're dealing with this subject. Otherwise, you're going to get confused. Okay? But Joseph Fitzmyer, the one he's quoting here, he was a professor at the Catholic University of America, famous for turning that theology department upside down, because he's a flaming liberal. And in the commentary that he wrote with Father Raymond E. Brown, the Jerome Biblical Commentary, 1968, in his commentary on Romans, he says that we're justified like the Protestants say, forensically, legally. Because the Greek word dikaiō and the Greek word logizomai mean they're legal terms, which is a big error. They're not legal terms. And I show why in my book, Not by Faith Alone, published in 1998. The word that's normally used for imputation, they think is a legal term because it comes from logizomai. The fact is, 24 times logizomai is used in the Greek New Testament, never once is it used as a legal term. So, that needs to be cleared up. But anyway, you see how confusing things can become. And I've got like 10 more pages here that I wrote on this that I'm not going to have time to cover today because I got to get to your questions. So maybe I'll just write this up and publish it, and you guys can have it yourself. See all the details that I put in there. Okay, so let me go up to the top here, see what was on your mind. Okay, Daniel says, from a Catholic moral theology point of view, is Judaism's rejection of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, unlawful and prohibited? Thus, Judaism is a lawless sect unauthorized by God. You don't need all that. It's just going to confuse the issue. Judaism was a valid religion up until the time that Jesus died on the cross. Okay? After that, it has been superseded by the new covenant in Jesus Christ. And there is only one covenant today. The new covenant in Jesus Christ, whereby all Jews, all Gentiles are required to come to for salvation. And that's it. There's no old covenant any longer. That has been superseded. The old covenant has been revoked. It has been rejected. I don't know how many times or how many words can be said to explain that to people, but it no longer has any legal force whatsoever. The only principles that it teaches, like you could read Exodus 2 when they worship the golden calf and get some moral teaching out of that, okay, or practical teaching. Obey God, that's the lesson, but that's all on a practical basis, not on a legal theocratic basis any longer. The only theocratic legal basis we have is Jesus Christ. Okay? For every Jew and Gentile that wants to leave this cursed world and be saved out of it and go into heaven and live with God. That's all there is. Okay? Anybody today, the old covenant has not been revoked, including the Catholic Catechism, is heretical. Okay? Understand that. Because nothing can change. Catholic doctrine doesn't change to fit the new circumstances of the day. If it does, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Okay? So a lot of the teaching today is not worth the paper it's written on because it's trying to change Catholic doctrine. But doesn't change. It always remains the same, especially when you're talking about the covenant. Okay? So Judaism is just a fragment of what was existing many centuries ago. And we would expect that. Anything that had an existence in bygone days is going to have remnants of its existence still existing, probably. Okay? That's just the way life is. But we don't call the remnants that exist today any real or close to what was in bygone days when it was sanctioned by God and protected by God and filled God in every way. Those days are over. Okay? All right. I hope I've answered your question. I tried to simplify it down to what the essence was. That's why I approached it the way I did. As if the earth were not at the center of the universe, could it still support life? God could make the universe any way he wants. God could put the earth off center someplace and have it support life. To say no would be to say something's impossible for God to do. And that's not impossible. The only thing that's impossible for God to do is to lie, to make something true that's false. That God can't do. Okay, but making the earth habitable, other than in the center, is certainly possible. Okay, but the question is, did he? Well, Scripture says no, the church says no, the fathers say no, and now science is telling us no. So, put all those together, shake them up, and you got a pretty good truth there. Dear Robert, since Pope Calixtus preached modalism, why is he venerated saint in the Catholic Church when Saint Hippolytus of Rome condemned him as a modalist who hurt the name of Saint Pope Zephyrinus? Who knows? I mean, You get all kinds of ideas and prejudices and opinions, yes, even among these people in the early church. Okay. And who can explain all the reasons why they did what they did? Okay. When you get down to the councils and why the councils said modalism was wrong, or the popes, yeah, I mean, that's when we pay attention. We all want to find out the rationale they used, because we may run into the same problem in our day, and we need to know what is the theological reason why modalism is wrong. Okay. Um, the idea that God comes in three modes instead of three persons. Okay. We need to know why that's wrong. But as far as these other details, they're not really important. Okay. Laura says, question, does a valid Catholic marriage require a priest? Yes, it requires a priest. That's what makes it Catholic, okay? Because you inside the church. And we know that it's not some spiritual idea. It is physical as spiritual. And so physical means that we have an actual vestments with an actual ceremony and actual canon law, and all that has to be in the ceremony that you would call Catholic. Okay, definitely. Question, I am curious about your thoughts on emotion in God. Are there any fathers' councils that mention this? Yes, that's what makes it interesting, is that half the fathers that talk about it believe God had emotion, the other half doesn't. Okay, so you have a controversy on that very issue. As a matter of fact, who is it? Lactantius says if you don't believe God has emotions, you're a pagan. So they went back and forth. Augustine went back and forth on this. At some points he says, no, God has no emotion. At other points he's very favorable to the idea. Okay. Usually you'll find this thought among the earlier fathers. Okay. The latter fathers get a little too, let's say, I don't know. They get a little too scholastic, like the scholastics did in the Middle Ages, where religion, theology, academic there. And usually in academics, you're going to concentrate on intellect, not the emotions. And to this in the Middle Ages against the scholastics, which came from the St. John's of the Cross, what's her name? Teresa of Avila, and a whole bunch of writers during that time, where the emotions of the Christian life were pronounced in competition against the scholastics like Bonaventure and St. Albert, and where Christianity a little too academic, you see. And that's easy. When you start talking about the physics of God's existence, it's very easy to get intellectual about all that stuff. And, they got so intellectual, we're growing from Aristotle, and we start talking about the physics class, the unmoved mover and all. And yet we sanctify it with theology by putting the word metaphysics on, as if that's going to absolve us of getting very, intellectual about all this and treating it like, building blocks or something. It's So, if you want to understand where all this came from with the fathers and why those that don't have any room for emotion are wrong, what's my book called? The unchangeable God, the immutable God who can change his mind, the impassible God who can show emotion. I mean, because you got to deal with Scripture. That's the bottom line. If Scripture is the Word of God, which we believe as Catholics it is, then you cannot dismiss these passages that speak of God with not only emotion, but intensity. I mean, it's just unreal. How, for years, because of Thomas's weak understanding of emotion that he got from Aristotle, that we've skipped over this for 800 years. And it's inhibited our understanding of who God really is. And it's inhibited our understanding of the atonement, of what Christ really did for us. Because if you don't understand the emotion of God, the anger of God, the wrath of God, any way you want to put it, you don't understand what atonement's about. Okay? And when you try to understand the atonement and the suffering and all that stuff in the midst of this mechanical, unmoved mover kind of thing, it's just doesn't fit. Doesn't fit. So we need some other ways to look at this to put it all together. That's what I'm offering the church. You've missed this for 800 years. You need to relook at this, and it will increase manifold your understanding of God so that you can understand what it is we're going through and why we're going through it. Because of this intense God that we have. And if you keep throwing all this intensity into metaphysics, where you just talk about things moving other things and all that, you're never going to understand it. Okay? You're going to get more confused when you do that. That's my offer to the church. Question. My church at times blesses someone such as for their 50th anniversary. They ask us to hold out our hands to lay our hands from a distance. Is this proper? It's okay. It's not going to hurt anybody. Question. Does a valid Catholic marriage? Yes, I already. Question. Recent debate between Orthodox apologists and two Thomists on YouTube and Twitter, citing Vatican II, Lumen Gentium, and Nostra Aetate. Do Muslims worship the one true God? Okay, so this is another place where the Catechism has, you could say, gone off the rails. You could say has not completed the story, depending on how nice. It's very easy in one sense, because if you define God, the Muslims do not believe in the same God we believe in. That is a fact. Okay? Now, if you want to define God as just, a monotheistic belief in a supreme being, yeah. If you want to make that, if you want to dilute the definition of who God is, I would include this last one. They just believe in as their one God. Okay, so now you're in a quandary where, well, gee, who do we limit? The Hindus, because they believe in 330 million gods, and well, we have to include the Buddhists because they believe in one God, and he's Buddha. Okay, so there is the criterion by which we make our distinction. Okay. The Muslims just happen to be a lot closer monotheistically thinks they believe in the same God that Abraham believed in, as if that makes it because to Abraham. Okay. See, the guys who wrote the Catechism, most of them are very liberal. Schönborn, who wrote the Catechism in 1992, is a flaming liberal. Okay? And we're lucky we got some conservative theology out of him for the Catechism. Somebody over and said, no, we're not going that far, and cleaned it up and produced what we finally have. Okay? That section, they didn't think it out, because if you're going to enter into that arena, put the definition of God so that you can include the Muslims, and you need to explain on the other side of the coin why the church before you didn't do that, okay? And explain you don't dilute the God. The traditional Trinitarian understanding that the Muslims don't fit in, and they're not worshiping the same God. You have to give that other side of the story if you're going to open this can of people that Muslims declare on TV that they hate Christianity and hate Jesus Christ are worshiping the same God that we do. There's a price to pay for your openness to include everybody. And that's what happened the 7 years. We somehow exclusivism and it be much more inclusive of the world, you see. So I don't know why they stopped with the Muslims, because they're closer to Abraham. And don't include the Buddhists, the same God as the Buddhists, because they all believe in one God. They're monotheists. See, this is where once you dilute the definition, you're not going to know where to stop. Okay. So, in my opinion, this was a mistake for the Catechism even to enter into this area. There's no need to go down that road. Look, this is a Christian book trying to tell Christians how to understand Christianity. We understand the Christianity through the God of Christianity, which is a triune God. We're crying out loud. We got to give everybody. We show love and kindness to everybody. By what? Diluting your religion? No, you're going down the wrong road again. Okay? So we've got a big problem with that. Question, does the forgiveness of sin include some? I'm not sure I understand your question there, Laura. Forgiveness is a mental that you have toward someone who's sinned against you. Okay, if you forgive them, that means you want to restore the relationship you had prior to the sin to disrupt that relationship. Okay, so that may or may not take suffering along with it to restore the relationship you feel to do something. That person know that whom you sinned against, that you mean business, that you're not just saying words. I will help you repair your house, or I will take you to the hospital, or I whatever works of mercy that you can do for that person to show them that you want to restore the relationship, that's going to be an amount of suffering for you. Okay? So, in that sense, the suffering's included, but it's not automatically included. It will come in the effort that you show to give kindness and everything else to against. Okay? It's going to cost you, okay? And the cost is usually a degree of suffering. I don't know anything that's ever cost anything that doesn't require suffering in one form or another. Okay? You know how like we pay a bill and the bill is less than what we thought it was, say it's $500 instead of $1,000, and what do we say in return? Oh, that was painless. You ever seen yourself do that? Yeah. Because there's a certain amount of pain in having to give a lot of money. That's suffering. So if I have to give less of myself in order to restore that relationship, it's much more painless than it would have been if I gave him the full amount. Okay? All right. All right. Ishmael, you say, was promised a part of the Abrahamic inheritance, hence Muslims, the heirs of the Arabs. Well, that was in the Old Testament. There's no guarantee from God of inheritance from Ishmael for the Arabs today. Okay, that there's no connection there. And thus there's no connection between Allah of Ishmael's day and Allah of today. Okay. The Arabs or the Muslims were created in the year 600, right around the 600 AD. Okay, long after Ishmael existed, or Abraham existed, or the Jews existed, or any of the Arab nations existed. Okay, that you have to keep in mind. That's a current event in the history of religion, not an ancient event. All right, let me go on. Should I admonish a family member about IVF, in vitro fertilization? Depends on how close you are. Okay, I mean, if you're close enough that you feel a responsibility that without your advice they may go down the wrong path, and you want them to at least have the information to make a intellectual decision that has all the criteria you need. Yeah. Now you take a risk there. Talk about suffering. You may lose that relationship because of it. And here's where you have to weigh one thing against the other. Is it worth my relationship with this person to tell them that IVF is wrong in hopes of saving their soul? Because if they make this decision and I don't tell them and then they sin, am I going to want that on my conscience? Okay, so you're in a dilemma. And the right thing to do is to use wisdom. Okay, you got to use wisdom, but you got to tell them. You got to tell them. That way, God will not hold you responsible. Only them. All right. All right, I'm looking for questions, not comments now. All right, we already answered that one. Question. Okay, here's a question. Is Peter the rock that destroys the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in both of Daniel? Is it Jesus? Both? Neither. It's neither. Um, could you please explain the difference between Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox? I'm not an expert on that, so you're going to have to find somebody else on that issue. Question. Does pistis mean faithfulness? Which part of your book on faith do you cover this? Pistis is just the word for faith, the Greek word for faith. So there's all kinds of variations to it. Pistis is just the noun form. You got the verbal form, the adjectival form. You've got suffixes and prefixes that can go on it. It's a big word, okay, in the sense that it's used in many, many different ways. So I'm not sure what your question is driving at here. The whole book deals with faith. Okay, faithfulness, faith, whatever. It's probably one of the most used words in the Greek, Koine Greek. So you have to read the whole story. You have to know the whole ball of wax before you can make any conclusions. All right. A lot of conversation today. Question. All right, here's one. I understand Judaism has no legal force, and of course I do believe that. But what about parishes that are holding Seder meals? Do we sin by attending such thing? Well, you may not sin, but you need to tell them, look, Seder meals are not for Christians. Seder meals were for Old Testament practices dealing with the Passover of that time. The Seder meal was a symbol of what they went through in the Passover and all that stuff. That is done. Christ is now our Passover. Okay? And the way we celebrate that is by the Eucharist, not a Seder meal. The Seder meal is being brought in to sort of dilute any kind of antagonism there once was between Christianity and Judaism. The idea now is to make Christianity and Judaism on the same level, that they both approach God just in a different way, but they're both equal. And we can walk shoulder to shoulder together and convert the world. That's the new idea. Okay? And anybody who is against that is either anti-Semitic or a supersessionist or this or that. But the false doctrine is winning today. Most of the priests and bishops in the Catholic Church are all of this mentality. They've been working for 70 years to reach this. Where Jews and Catholics can walk together just in different modes. But the Jews are no longer separated. They still have their old covenant, you see, and we have our new covenant in Christ, and they're not required to believe in Christ. Christ will come to them in a different way. I mean, as the Catechism says, he's going to come with traits that are not known. Oh, really? Traits that are not known. Wow. What are they? Well, it doesn't explain what they are. Yeah, paragraph 839, 840. It's just a mess today. Okay, so be careful. There he goes. John says, after Christ, the Old Testament rites are not only dead, mortua, but their observance is deadly. Mortifera. Thank you, John. Here's one guy who gets it. All right, here's a question. Oh, and I keep forgetting I can put these questions up on the board. Sorry about that, folks. Are photons / quantum fields divisible as matter or only as composites of matter and form? I think there's more to your question than meets the eye since you've added matter and form. Because sometimes they're metaphysical terms. But let me just answer it from a purely scientific. Photons are, it's interesting because one theory that I like is that that light, when it appears in the baryonic universe, that's atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons into atoms and molecules. That's baryonic. As opposed to the quantum particulate field, which is not baryonic. It's made up of Planck particles. And that when energy moves from a quantum field to a baryonic field, it comes in the form of a photon. That's one theory. So that the photon is not a indivisible, if you want to call it that, particle. Okay? That the photon is something that's made from something else. That's divisible. Quantum fields themselves, depending on how far down you go, if you go down to the actual Planck particle of 10 to the minus 35 meters, that's indivisible. That's the whole reason why you have a Planck particle, is to get down to the essence of matter that is matter still at this small gauge. And the smallest gauge is 10 to the minus 35 meters. Anything that's smaller than that is not matter anymore. It's not matter. Okay? That's how we understand the quantum world. So in that sense, it's indivisible. The quantum world is indivisible. Okay? So that's as far as I'm going to take it. Okay, so here's God can create. Well, that's not a question, is it? No. All right, let's see where we are. Question. I sent my email question too late, minutes before the stream. They were... I'm trying to find them. Okay, here's your question. Sorry, I sent my email question way late. Fresh and saltwater fish in the flood. What happened? Well, you really didn't have salt water until you had the flood. You know, if you look at it logically. You had fresh water that now turned into salt water because it was mixed with all the salt in the land surface of the world. And so now the salt water became the predominant water, and the fresh water, if you could find it, was rare. Okay? You would find the fresh water in places that were internal to the landmass instead of on the outskirts of the landmass. The stuff on the boundaries of the landmass. The water that was on the boundaries of the landmass was constantly rolling off the land surface into the ocean basins, and that's all salt. Okay? Now, we don't mean like table salt. When we use the word salt, we're talking mostly about sodium, lithium, potassium, all those first row elements in the periodic table. That's, or you could consider rare earths. They're somewhat in the middle of the periodic table. Some of them are salts. Magnesium, which is in the middle, that could be a salt. Barium, things like that. But generally, those, potassium, sodium, lithium, those are high concentration salts that make up the mountain surfaces, and that's where the water drains off. So that's why we have salt water today, okay, because of the flood. Annihilation of the dam, is that possible? You seem open to it because the church has not declared any against it. I mean, if you look at what the church has said, there are probably half a dozen or more dogmatic statements about hell being eternal. Okay? The church is clear about that. But she's not clear about the punishment being eternal in the sense of poene sensus, that is the sense of pain, being eternal. And that is with good reason, because in a issue of justice, the question is how much punishment, physical punishment, if you want to put it that way, or punishment of pain, equals the sin or the evil done. Okay, it can't be infinite. You can't have crime, because that would even disrupt understanding of the degrees of crime. How can you have degrees of crime if you're going to give an infinite punishment degree of crime? Okay, so issue of not ever being with God would be no possibility that anyone who went to hell for their punishment is ever going to see God or get into heaven. But there's a possibility that their physical punishment would be limited to the degree of crimes on earth. Then they could be annihilated. I'm not saying this is true. I'm theoretically, theologically speaking, it could be. And the church would have the last say on this, of course. I'm just posing something for the church to think about. The way that the church covers this issue in her dogmatic statements is not definitive as to the punishment of pain lasting for eternity, never stopping. Okay? Which means that there is room to think, oh, that could stop, but the punishment of hell is still eternal in the sense that they'll never see God. Okay? That's a theoretical possibility. Okay? All right. We got about 5 more minutes left. Dr. says, what is opinion on Wolfgang Smith? Personally, I think he is the greatest cosmologist, philosopher in the last 100 years. I have mixed opinions. about Wolfgang Smith. I do not like his philosophy of Platonism. Okay, he was a pure Platonist who believed in the demiurge and everything else that went along with it. And then alongside of that, he believed that there was ways to tap into the demiurge that were extra natural, like tongues, speaking in tongues, dreams, visions, miraculous activity, all that kind of stuff. And I told him about this, so it's not like I'm, And I told him, I want nothing to do with that. And so in that, insofar as his philosophy and his Platonism and his tapping into cultish activities to communicate with this other world, no. And then he had this whole idea that, I wrote a big paper on it. It's available on our website. My mind's a little fuzzy on it right now, so I'd better not talk about it. But as far as his geocentrism, which is how I met him, he contacted me. He had dealt with geocentrism basically on a philosophical level. He did not know about the scientific level, like the Michelson-Morley experiment. I introduced him to all that. And he was enthralled with it. The Airy experiments, Arago, all that stuff. The CMB, he didn't know anything about that. His concentration on geocentrism was just philosophical, that this was a great way to look at the universe. And that's where it stopped. Okay, so he had to be educated to the scientific side of geocentrism. And to be perfectly honest with you, we broke apart by his doing, because he didn't like the fact that I exposed Albert Einstein for the immoral fraud that he was. He wrote me like 2 letters saying, great book, Galileo was wrong, your fantastic analysis of the experiments, blah, 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 blah. Best book I ever read, blah, blah, blah. And then he wrote back another letter and said, I want nothing to do with this because you attacked Albert Einstein personally. And not only was it Albert Einstein, I have a whole chapter on the wiles of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Einstein, and Newton. Not your best moral characters in the world. And I mean bad. These were bad men. They lived immoral lives. And I think people should know about that. And it was so immoral that you wonder how their science wasn't affected by their lifestyle. That's how bad it was. You can find out about this by reading Galileo Was Wrong. I think it's in volume 2 now. You'll be appalled. You just wonder how these men could live this way. Albert Einstein died of syphilis, for Pete's sake, because he was such a whoremonger. And you don't think it's, important to know about that? And this is what the men of the world try to do. They try to separate their moral life from their scientific life and say one has nothing to do with the other. Really? Not the way I see it. Because your immoral life shows that you don't believe in God, or you think you're going to get away with something, and your disbelief in God is going to reflect directly on how you interpret the scientific data. Directly. You're not going to be immune to it. That's why it's important. And he split with him and never talked to me again. That was back in 2010. Okay? So I don't have a great amount of room in my heart for Wolfgang Smith, to be very honest with you, for several reasons, as I have explained. All right, so it is time to go. All right, yes, time to go. I'll see you here next week on the 9th of July. And thank you for coming and being a part of this program. I hope I have helped you in ways that will bring you closer to God. Thank you so much. Please pray for me, and I will pray for you. And we'll see you again next week. Take care.